not actually a philosopher of mind. I sort of work on implicit bias because I'm interested in discrimination and the moral issues surrounding discrimination and race and gender. So I've kind of stumbled into this through that. So one of the reasons why I'm delighted to be here is that I'll learn lots about the implicit mind, and hopefully that will help me develop my thinking on this topic as well. What I want to do in this talk is think about models of implicit bias. So I'm going to use Edouard's slides from the last session. If we remember the picture of the brain with all the different bits, the psychological basis of the trait, and some of those bits were like the associative part, so black danger or men philosophy. Maybe there's some kind of associations between race and fear, affective responses. That's the kind of stuff that I'm interested in this talk. They're called implicit biases. Some philosophers also talk about them as implicit attitudes, which I think gets them into the kind of trouble that we saw in the last talk. But I'm interested in sort of not the attitude as a whole, but just the implicit bias bit of the attitude. And I'm interested in what a good model of those implicit biases might be. So there've recently been various philosophical attempts to give a model of implicit bias. And I found myself thinking, well, sort of how do I evaluate these? How do I work out which is a good way of thinking about implicit bias? So what I try to do in this paper is set out some desiderata for a good model of implicit bias, and then apply them to three recently developed models of implicit bias, and see how they fare in relation to those desiderata. And the other thing that I want to do is also sort of foreground a set of what I think are importantly neglected cases of implicit bias, and that when we think about these models in light of these neglected cases with our desiderata in mind, it helps us to evaluate where these models might have gone wrong. So that's the plan. I'm going to give you some desiderata, give you some test cases for thinking about those, which motivate those desiderata and which allow us to then think about the models of implicit bias, and then evaluate those models of implicit bias and suggest where I think they're going wrong. And I don't have a fully worked out positive account. This is kind of on the way to that. So I'm very happy if in the discussion you think that we can defend some of these models of implicit bias, or if you've got proposals of ways in which we could proceed to get a better model, that's great. I'm happy to hear that. Okay, so just so we've all got in mind the kind of things that I'm talking about, I mean, I take it everyone here is pretty familiar with the idea of implicit bias, but the sort of things I'm interested in are the kinds of the phenomena, the kinds of states or processes, who knows what they are, that are involved in subtle discrimination. So, for example, the kinds of associations between racial groups and certain negative stereotypes that might have the result of influencing people's evaluations of CVs. So in the famous CV study, when identical CVs were presented to a group of people, the only difference was the race of the person whose name was at the top. The ones which were marked by their stereotypically white name were evaluated as better than the ones with a stereotypically black name. So that's the kind of phenomena that I'm interested in, the sort of biases that are driving that sort of behavior. So if we wanted to get a model of these implicit biases, what would a good model look like? Well, here are some desiderata that I've come up with. So they're on the handout. Don't claim these to be exhaustive. Maybe there are other good desiderata that we might want to build into our models as well, but here's a start. Okay. So firstly, we should want our models of implicit bias to have empirical validity. So they should cohere with or be supported by the best empirical evidence we have about implicit biases. So for example, we might want them to cohere with evidence about whether they're propositional in structure, so this is the kind of view that Eric's been developing, or whether they're associative in structure. Like our view should accommodate the findings about the structure of implicit biases. But of course, it might well be that the data that we've got underdetermines our theory, might not tell us enough about which theoretical model we should endorse. Maybe it's open to different interpretations. So that's not going to be decisive. We might need other criteria to deploy as well. So another thing we might have in mind is whether or not a model of implicit bias coheres with other things we might want to say about our theory of cognition. So does it rely on posits or states or processes that are familiar to us from other aspects of our theory of cognition? That might be another thing that we use to evaluate our theory. Not to say that a good theory is going to incorporate all and only those things that already feature in our theory of cognition. Maybe, and as we'll see, some of the recent accounts give us quite revisionary understandings of the sorts of things we could incorporate into our theories of cognition. But we at least then want a story about how those revisionary posits might relate to the more familiar states. So how those revisionary states interact with beliefs as we understand them, and so on. From my point of view, I'm not only interested in understanding kind of what's in our mind and how it produces behavior, but also what this means for us as moral agents, as moral beings. And so for that reason, another thing that I'm interested in a theory of implicit bias, in a model of implicit bias, is that it provides a framework for moral evaluation, for understanding what it means for us as moral agents. This is going to be an important desiderata when we come to think about our test cases, and I hope that in going through those test cases it'll motivate a bit more this particular desiderata, because I think this might be one that not everyone is happy to endorse. But it seems to me that we should want our theory to at least give us a framework for moral evaluation. Of course, it's not going to deliver judgments about agents. We're going to have to import various other assumptions about responsibility, character, virtue perhaps. But it should at least give us a framework which, together with those assumptions, helps us to make those kinds of evaluations of us as moral agents. So what it means for us as moral agents when we fit this part of our theory of cognition into our overall understanding of agency. And finally, with respect to implicit bias, because it's interesting and important not just to be able to articulate what it is, but how to change it, how to combat implicit bias, one thing that would be good for our model to deliver is a kind of framework for generating hypotheses that can be tested with respect to how to combat implicit bias. So we should hope that our model of implicit bias gives us some clue as to the kind of things we might want to say about, well, look, if this is the structure of implicit bias, this is the kind of thing that might help in changing implicit bias. And then we could test that, and that might give us some further input into whether our model is a good one, whether it's one that's useful in combating implicit bias. Okay, so those are four things that we might look for in our models of implicit bias. And maybe there are others. I'm not denying that. I don't think these are going to be exhaustive, but these are the things that I'm going to focus on, or at least are a start in our guiding desiderata for evaluating models of implicit bias. Okay, so I've presented these desiderata. Now I'm going to present 3 test cases. And there's a few reasons for doing this. So one is that I want the introduction of these test cases to kind of do some work in propping up my desiderata. I hope they show why it's important that we should use these desiderata, especially the third and fourth ones, the ones to do with moral evaluation and to do with generating testable hypotheses. Secondly, these test cases are going to help us to evaluate the models of implicit bias that I'll later introduce. But thirdly, introducing these test cases refocuses our attention on an important class of cases of implicit bias, which I think have been really neglected in the philosophical literature. So it's overwhelmingly the case that when philosophers have addressed the phenomena of implicit bias, they've been looking at cases where there's a conflict between an individual's explicit beliefs or explicit values and their implicit biases. So the person who says, I'm not racist, I'm not sexist, who has beliefs in racial equality and gender equality, but nonetheless is influenced by implicit bias. So we can call those kind of conflictual cases, cases where there's a conflict between implicit biases and the agent's stated explicit beliefs or values. But this is to overlook the kinds of cases where there isn't that kind of conflict, where the agent is wholeheartedly racist or sexist. So when they have explicit beliefs or values, which are racist or sexist, for example. But there's also still all the implicit stuff going on there, right? So it's not the case that in those instances where somebody's a wholehearted racist, there isn't still the same phenomena going on. It's just that maybe it's less interesting to look at that because we've got other explanations for their behavior, namely the explicit beliefs. And I think it's not at all surprising that we've, as philosophers, focused on the kind of conflict cases rather than the one where there's alignments between the explicit and implicit biases, because of course these are the surprising cases. They're the ones that confront us. We think, gosh, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-sexist, but nonetheless I might be implicitly biased. So that's one reason why we focused on these. They pose a challenge to our self-conceptions. It's also the case that's where lots of really interesting philosophical work happens, right? So these are the cases these conflict cases where there's a lack of alignment between implicit and explicit biases are ones where there's loads of interesting philosophical work to be done. Things like, what does this mean for our responsibility, or what does it mean for our understanding of character, or what does it mean for how we understand attitudes and so on. So, of course, there's good reasons for focusing on those cases. And it's perhaps also really pragmatically efficacious to look at those kinds of conflict cases, because those are the ones where you think, well, great, people are well motivated to try to fix bias in these cases, and so there's good reason to sort of focus our attention on what we should say about these cases and what we should say in terms of how to mitigate bias, because we're well motivated. If we can eliminate these implicit biases, then great, we've gone some way to challenging, combating discrimination. And maybe we shouldn't be so optimistic as thinking that would be effective in the cases where there's aligned explicit and implicit biases. So of course there's lots of good reasons for having focused on these cases of conflict between explicit and implicit biases, or implicit biases and explicit beliefs and values. I'm trying not to say explicit attitudes after Edouard's talk. But I think that's led us to overlook what's going on in these cases where there's alignments between explicit beliefs and values and implicit biases. And I think that's led to some problems in the models of implicit bias that have been developed, which I'll go on to mention. Okay, so here are the three test cases. Here are the three cases that I want to later use to evaluate those models of implicit bias. So these are kind of, especially the second, they're gerrymandered test cases. They're kind of philosophically constructed test cases. But I hope that you agree with me that they're plausible, they're empirically defensible, and they kind of tease out interesting dimensions of the phenomena that we're talking about. So the first one, fairly familiar and depressing phenomena, just the explicit bigot who has explicit racist attitudes, also implicit racial bias, and doesn't really care about either of those things. And we can imagine, for our purposes, this individual in a context of hiring. And this individual is perfectly happy to let his explicit racist views guide his hiring decision. But it's also the case that when in that context, some of the kinds of behavioral manifestations of implicit bias are also there, right? So the kind of faster eye blink responses, the increased sweating that comes with his discomfort, the slightly greater seating distance from the black candidate, they're all going to be there, as well as the explicit repugnant beliefs that he holds. So, I mean, just to convince you that we should accept this claim that those manifestations of implicit bias are still there, we should remember the studies by Devine et al., which showed that implicit associations were stronger in individuals who had explicitly racist beliefs. So to the extent that they cared less about treating people fairly, being non-discriminatory, they had stronger implicit associations. And so we should expect these kinds of behavioral manifestations that are observable in the conflict cases where people have explicitly non-prejudiced attitudes but implicit bias. We should expect all those kind of behavioral manifestations that seem to be tracking the implicit bias to still be there when we've got the explicit racist beliefs as well. Okay, so this individual discriminates, he intends to discriminate, he doesn't care about that. one of the ways in which his discrimination is manifested is through these kind of subtle automatic responses, as well as perhaps explicit objectionable behavior that he engages in as well. Okay, let's contrast that case to another still repugnant character, but who differs in one crucial respect. So this individual we're calling the well-intentioned bigot. So this individual does have explicit racist attitudes. He also has implicit racial biases, but he also cares very much about his protocol at work. So he is aware that his workplace environment is one which says discrimination is not okay, and maybe he actually genuinely cares about getting the best person for the job. And so he genuinely commits to not discriminating. He thinks, well, I want to get the best person for the job. Maybe that person is a black person. I will be committed to hiring that person then. Because of his explicit racial beliefs, maybe he thinks things like, but I hope I don't have to go for after-work drinks with them or invite them around to my house at the weekend and things like that. But he's willing to be their colleague because he's concerned to, well, he cares very much about his job, right? So he's got different values in play. And I guess this is what all of us are like, right? We have different values in play, not racist ones, but it's often the case that things we care about come into conflict with other things we care about. So this individual, he has these explicit racist values, implicit race bias, but also forms the intention not to discriminate because he cares very much about his work environment and getting the best person for the job. But if we imagine him in a hiring context once again, even though he's got this intention not to discriminate, the manifestations of his implicit bias are still there. So again, he has these faster eye blink responses, he manifests his discomfort, he sits slightly further away, maybe he reacts with slightly greater hostility in these interracial interactions. So he does discriminate and he ends up not hiring the well-qualified as equally qualified as the white candidate. He doesn't hire the black candidate. Okay, so we've got these two test cases, the bigot and the well-intentioned bigot, and let's just contrast those two individuals with the, by now, familiar example. So this is, I guess, like the kind of poster child of the implicit bias literature, the biased egalitarian. So somebody who has explicitly egalitarian and fair-minded beliefs and values. They're committed to not discriminating, but they have implicit bias. And so again, if we imagine this individual in a hiring context, it might be that they end up discriminating, not hiring the equally qualified black candidate, because there's the manifestation of their implicit biases that affect their interaction with that candidate. Okay. So a couple of things to note about these test cases before we move on to use them in our evaluating of the models of implicit bias. The first is that, as I've already mentioned, important to mention again, contrary to the overwhelming focus of the philosophical literature on implicit bias, two of our cases here are ones where there's alignment between implicit bias and the agent's explicit behavior, explicit beliefs and values. Okay. And I think it's important to note that, and it's going to be an important feature of these cases when we come to think about the models of implicit bias, that there is that alignment, but nonetheless, implicit bias is still there, it's still playing an explanatory role. But I've also said that I think these cases help to motivate the desiderata. So I'm engaging in standard philosophical intuition pumps here, which maybe some people have problems with that methodology. But I'm asking you to share my intuitions about these cases, that there's a moral difference. There's a difference in the moral evaluation of all these individuals. So one of them is clearly repugnant in both his explicit and implicit beliefs and in his behavior. Still repugnant, the well-intentioned bigot still has these wholly objectionable values and beliefs, but it seems to me he's slightly less bad than the outright bigot because he at least intends not to discriminate. At least it's a small credit to him that he's trying not to discriminate. And of course, we might judge both of those individuals quite differently from the biased egalitarian. Many people have the intuition that this individual is not at all responsible. I don't share that intuition. I think they're to some extent blameworthy, but certainly much less bad, much less morally bad and much less blameworthy than either the bigot or well-intentioned bigots, right? At least their explicit beliefs and values are on the right track. Okay, so we've got our 4 desiderata, and I've just presented the 3 test cases, which again, I hope motivate those desiderata. Firstly, because we should want to be able to explain, or at least we should want a model of implicit bias that gives us a framework for helping to explain these differences in moral evaluation. And also because if we think about the kinds of interventions that might be needed to combat discrimination in these cases, different things are going to be required, right? So what it takes to combat discrimination in the case of the biased egalitarian is going to be quite different from what it takes in the case of the well-intentioned bigot and in the outright bigot as well. So we should want a theory that helps us to generate those kind of hypotheses about the different kind of interventions that might be required. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to look at 3 models of implicit bias and suggest that when we think about them in light of these test cases and our desiderata, we see that something's going wrong with these models. And I don't yet know how to fix them, but at least we can identify the problem that might help us to get a better model of implicit bias. Okay. So the first model I want to look at is the model that we get from Neil Levy. He presents us with an understanding of implicit bias, according to which we say implicit biases are what he calls patchy endorsements. What are they? He's locating this view in the context of the debate about whether implicit biases are propositional or associative, so the debate that Eric's engaged in. And he wants to say, well, it doesn't look like the evidence really allows us to take a clear stance on whether they're one or the other. Comes to the conclusion maybe they're neither. He calls them neither fish nor fowl. Like, we can't see implicit biases as obviously propositional and functioning in the way that propositional states do. But it's true that they seem to have some structure that shouldn't lead us to say they're wholly associative. So he calls them patchy endorsements. So a kind of state which does have some propositional content, but which isn't integrated into the agent's attitude. It can't be inferentially sensitive in the way that thoroughgoing propositional states, like explicit beliefs, might be. So he thinks that they're not sufficiently reasons responsive for us to see them as the kinds of propositional states that can be well integrated into a full set of inferential relations with the agent's other attitudes. So they're patchy. They're patchy. In some respects, they seem propositional, but they're not reasons responsive in the right kind of way. And there are 2 important features of his view for our present purposes. So firstly, this idea that because they're patchy, we shouldn't see them as well integrated into the agents and the agent's other endorsements. So they might be in conflict with certain of the agent's explicit endorsements. They're certainly not well integrated with them. They don't cohere with them in a structured way. And this is relevant to, Levy's interested in the same kind of question that I'm interested in, the question of moral evaluation and moral responsibility for implicit bias. And Levy wants to say, well, this patchiness helps us to understand and delivers us a good moral framework for thinking about responsibility and moral evaluation for implicit bias. The patchiness generates a counterfactual, which he says helps us to make these kind of evaluations of responsibility. The counterfactual is that had the agent's explicit attitudes controlled behavior, then their action would have had a different moral character. So he thinks that this is going to be the case when implicit biases are in play. We've got a patchy endorsement in play. It's one that's not well integrated with the agent's attitudes. So it's the case that had the agent's explicit values and beliefs been guiding behavior, it would have had a different moral character. Would have been, so take our biased egalitarian. If her explicit beliefs and values had been guiding behavior, would have been a fair-minded and non-discriminatory action. But because her implicit biases have had a role, because these patchy endorsements have been playing a role, we get an action that has a different moral character. It's discriminatory and morally problematic. And Levy develops this account, I should say, by focusing on these kind of conflict cases, so cases where there isn't alignment between the explicit and implicit views of the agent. Implicit biases and explicit views of the agent. Okay, so the two things on this model, patchy endorsements, so not well integrated, and then this counterfactual that helps us with the moral evaluation. How does this model help us with thinking about these test cases and thinking about the desiderata? I mean, it looks like it's doing okay according to our desiderata. So we've got a model that's positing this new kind of state, patchy endorsements, but they're kind of located within a theory of cognition that has familiar ideas in it, right? Propositional and associative states. He's claiming that it's providing us with a framework for moral evaluation. So it looks like if that's something that we care about, it's doing okay according to that desiderata. And it's also the case that it seems like we're getting some framework for thinking about how you might combat implicit biases. So if they're not responsive to reasons in the way that Levy wants to emphasize, if they're inferentially insensitive in the way he wants to emphasize, then it looks like the kinds of strategies that would just engage in reasoning about discrimination and reasoning about racial equality, those strategies aren't going to be effective. So it looks like we're getting at least a framework for thinking about the kinds of hypotheses for intervention that could be tested. But I think that when we think about our three test cases, we see that, in fact, problems arise and things are going wrong somewhere in this model. So I want to think about Levy's account in relation in particular to case B, our well-intentioned bigot. So this is a case where we've got aligned explicit beliefs and values and implicit biases. So it doesn't look like we've got a case where the implicit biases are not well integrated with the agent's values, with the agent's explicit endorsements. It looks like they are well integrated. And indeed, in an early version of this paper, Levy said something like, yeah, well, in these cases, there just isn't a patch endorsement to speak of. It looks like it's just now part of the agent's coherent set of values. He sort of stepped back from that claim in the last version of this, which I think he's right to do, but he still thinks that in these cases where we've got these kind of integrated and aligned explicit and implicit attitudes, he's calling them attitudes at least, but implicit biases, Levy thinks his counterfactual's going to be false. So it's not the case that were the agent's explicit values or beliefs to be guiding behavior, the action would have a different moral character. He thinks, well, if you've got a case where the agent's explicit and implicit attitudes are aligned, then we're just not going to have a difference in the moral character of the action when it's the agent's implicit biases that are having an influence on behavior. But I hope we can see by looking at that case B that that's just wrong. That can't be right. We've got a case where there's alignment between the attitudes, so they're well integrated. But Levy's counterfactual, contrary to what he thinks, is going to turn out true. Because what we've got is a case where, as I've described it, the implicit biases are having a role such that what we've got is unintentional discrimination. But if either of the agent's explicit attitudes were controlling behavior or determining behavior, we'd have actions with completely different moral characters. If it was the agent's explicit racism guiding behavior, then we'd have intentional discrimination, which is clearly a different moral quality of action than unintentional discrimination. And if it was his explicit commitment to not discriminate for the sake of the fact that he cares about his workplace protocol, then we would have non-discriminatory action, which again is a completely different moral character of the action. So Levy's counterfactual doesn't give us a good tool. It's not sufficiently fine-grained for the kind of moral evaluation that it looks like we want to do. If we want to be teasing apart the moral evaluations between our cases A, B, and C, doesn't look like his counterfactual is giving us a good way of doing that. Looks like he's committed to saying that because in A and B there's integration of the attitudes, it's just straightforwardly the case that we've got same moral quality of action, same degree of responsibility. But it doesn't seem like we should say that. It seems like we should want to discriminate between what's going on in A and B. It seems like his counterfactual delivers the wrong conclusion with respect to B. We should say it's true. So this framework of Patchi endorsements, I think, doesn't deliver us a good framework for thinking about the moral evaluation of agents who are influenced by implicit bias. Nor, I think, does it help us in thinking about generating interventions, so interventions which might combat implicit bias. The reason for this is that in these kinds of cases where there's alignment between explicit beliefs and values and implicit biases, the implicit biases are obscured from Levy's picture. Insofar as they're integrated into the agent, we just don't have a good grasp on the explanatory role that they might be playing. So insofar as that's the case, if we wanted to generate testable hypotheses for how to combat implicit biases in cases where they're running alongside, maybe that's not a good metaphor, but they're there with the explicit discriminatory attitudes, we haven't got a good framework for doing that on Levy's view, because it just overlooks implicit biases in these cases, because there's no patchiness there. They're integrated into the agent. So in sum, I don't think this model of thinking of implicit biases as Patchi endorsements is very helpful, doesn't deliver as good framework for moral evaluation, and it doesn't deliver good hypotheses, testable hypotheses for intervention strategies, at least not in cases where there's alignments between implicit and explicit attitudes. Okay, how are we doing for time? Okay, some quick remarks about two further models of implicit bias. So the second model that we might want to consider, if we're not convinced by the Patchi endorsement model, and if we're thinking, okay, well, where else might we look? Here's another model that's recently been presented, which is that we should think of implicit biases as kind of in-between beliefs. This is a model that Schwitzgebel presents. So to be fair, he's presenting this model, he's trying to defend the idea of in-between beliefs, but he suggests that implicit bias is a really good example that shows that in-between beliefs is a cogent category that we should incorporate into our theory of cognition. So he's not trying to give a model of implicit bias, but he's using implicit bias as a kind of way of defending his account of in-between beliefs. But nonetheless, we can ask, okay, well, is this a good way of thinking about implicit bias? Does it offer us a helpful model for thinking about implicit bias? Okay, so what is in-between belief? Well, Schwitzgebel has a model of belief that's dispositional. So to believe P is just to have a dispositional profile that we would attribute the belief to you on the basis of certain beliefs, certain behaviors or patterns in cognition or affect that you might demonstrate. So let's take an individual who has the sort of biased egalitarian case. This individual might have certain behavioral dispositions that lead us to ascribe to her the belief in racial equality. So she goes to and takes seriously the anti-racism training at her institution. She avows that she's committed to not discriminating. She's, in many ways, behaving in ways that would lead us to attribute to her the belief in racial equality. But suppose it's also true that we notice some behavioral dispositions that are the kind of things we would attribute to somebody who doesn't have the belief in racial equality, who has a belief in racial inequality. So she's slightly slower in calling on the students in her class of racial minorities. Maybe she reacts with surprise when she reads a really high quality essay by one of her black students. These kinds of dispositions that would lead us to suggest, well, if you have those kind of behavioral dispositions, it doesn't look like you actually really do believe in racial equality. Looks like you've got some belief in racial inequality. Schwitzgebel wants to say, well, insofar as we find somebody with these behavioral dispositions, some of which look like they're consistent with believing in racial equality, some of which look like they're consistent with believing in racial inequality, what we should say is that she has an in-between belief. It's not straight out true of her that she believes either in racial equality or in racial inequality. It's not true of her that she vacillates between those two beliefs. She's got an in-between belief, he wants to say. One crucial feature of this account that it's worth us noting at this point is that the basis on which beliefs are attributed, Schwitzgebel says, are on the basis of dispositional profiles, features of which are broadly recognizable to normal attitude ascribers. So they're kind of things that, the person on the street, kind of behaviors or behavioral dispositions that the person on the street would be able to pick out as saying, well, this is the kind of behavior that you'd show if you had that kind of belief. So how is this going to help us in thinking about implicit bias? Is it a useful model for thinking about implicit bias? Well, again, we've got this kind of revisionary understanding, but it's located within familiar items in our theories of cognition, beliefs. And it looks like that's going to help us in thinking about moral evaluation. So we might have certain other assumptions, auxiliary assumptions about responsibility for belief and when you're responsible and morally evaluable on the basis of certain beliefs that you hold. And we could import those into our understanding and say, well, this generates for us a framework for thinking about responsibility for implicit bias or responsibility for your in-between beliefs. And it looks like it'll help us with thinking about how to change implicit bias, right? So it's a matter of just changing your beliefs. Whatever mechanisms are good for changing beliefs or changing the dispositional profiles associated with your beliefs, let's import those. But I think, again, worries arise when we think about this model in relation to the cases of aligned explicit and implicit bias. So in a way, that's no surprise, because this in-between belief model is sort of developed in thinking about a case where there's conflict between the implicit bias and the agent's explicit beliefs and values. So it's no surprise that it doesn't fare very well when we're trying to explain what's going on in cases where there's alignment between the explicit and the implicit attitude. So again, look at our case B, the well-intentioned bigot. There's no in-between there. There's no in-between belief. It's just wholehearted, outright belief in racism or racial inequality. And of course, he does care about his workplace protocols, so it's also the case that he has some behavioral dispositions consistent with caring about other things. But so maybe some of his colleagues, depending on how much he reveals to them, will think that he has some dispositional profiles associated with not being a racist because he's trying not to discriminate. But I think that's an epistemic matter of how much they can access his beliefs, rather than, we shouldn't say it's the case that he doesn't all out believe in racial inequality. He's got these explicit, he's fully signed up to those discriminatory beliefs. So why is that a problem? Well, it just means that we're again overlooking the role of implicit bias in these cases. Recall that what's going on when beliefs are being attributed on the Schwitzgebel model is that we're looking at the kinds of dispositional profiles that would lead normal observers to ascribe a belief. And it looks like when we're thinking about individuals like the well-intentioned bigot, there's going to be dispositional profiles there that allow us to attribute that belief, that allow normal observers to attribute the explicitly racist beliefs. And it's very unlikely that they're going to appeal to the kinds of subtle behavior that we know are often the manifestations of implicit bias. So it's very unlikely that the normal attitude ascriber would appeal to things like greater skin conductance in those contexts, or faster eye blink rates, or sitting slightly further away. I mean, these kinds of subtle behavioral manifestations are hard to notice, right? Which is why it's surprising when we find out that we do them. I don't think they're impossible to detect, but they're hard to notice. So they're not the kinds of behavioral dispositions that normal attitude ascribers would rely on in attributing the belief. Of course, there's lots of other things that they can rely on, his explicit avowals of racist doctrines. So whilst it's not strictly incompatible with this in-between belief model that we could capture something about implicit bias, it certainly looks like it's really overlooking the explanatory role that implicit biases are playing in the behavioral manifestations in those scenarios. So it doesn't seem like it readily offers us the resources to capture the explanatory role of implicit bias. Maybe there are ways this could be fixed, and if you think so, then I'd be really happy to hear them in how we could develop this model to be more sensitive to those kinds of implicit biases in this kind of context. but it seems we'd be departing from in-between belief in making that move. Okay, I'll finish by finally saying some things about Edouard's model. So on this view, which we're all now familiar with, we think of attitudes as traits. So they're not implicit or explicit. They're dispositions to cognize, feel, and behave in certain ways. So far, the models I've looked at have been ones which try to say, well, here's how we should think about implicit biases. They're patchy endorsements, or they're in-between beliefs. But here we get a model that says, well, maybe there is no distinction between implicit and explicit attitudes. I'm very sympathetic to the trait model, but I think it doesn't help us in thinking about the kind of test cases and the desiderata that we've got, because it just is incomplete as it stands. So it's still the case that with respect to the psychological basis of traits, some of those are going to be the kind of things we talk about as implicit, and some of those are going to be the kind of things we talk about as explicit. So again, the well-intentioned bigot's explicit intention not to discriminate, and then the well-intentioned bigot's disposition to in fact behave in ways which manifest greater hostility, greater discomfort in interracial interactions. We don't yet have a good framework for thinking about the implicit and explicit psychological parts of the psychological bases of traits. And I think that's what we need before we can apply that trait model to these cases and look at how it fares. And I don't yet have that positive account. So that's something that I'm attempting, well, on the way to developing. So one of the ideas that we've been thinking about, so with Robin and Tom, my collaborators on our bias project, is thinking about it in terms of the kind of control that people might exercise over some of these dispositions. So I'm not convinced that introspectability is a distinctive or a useful way of distinguishing between implicit and explicit states or processes or associations. Maybe one way to go is to think about it in terms of the kind of control that can be exercised over different aspects of those psychological bases of traits. So I'd be happy to talk much more about how that might go, because it's all at the sort of nebulous stage of yet to be developed. So in sum, I've evaluated 3 accounts, 3 models of implicit bias, and I've suggested that each of them are in some respects unsatisfactory when we're thinking about those desiderata, and when we're thinking about the desiderata with relation in particular to these test cases. And my main aim has been to convince that we really need to think quite carefully about our models of implicit bias in relation to these desiderata, and secondly, that we shouldn't overlook the role that implicit bias plays in cases where there's alignments between explicit and implicit, well, explicit beliefs and values and implicit biases. And I think it's a mistake that the literature has focused so much on those conflict cases, which has led to these somewhat dissatisfactory models. Thanks.